Chapter 5, Mishnah 4. The previous Mishnah mentioned 4 days of the year, according to one Tana, when people buy animals and slaughter them before the day is over. As taught there, this is relevant to the law of Osav Espino. The following Mishnah teaches that it is relevant to other matters as well. On these 4 occasions, if a butcher sells an animal and the buyer wants the butcher to slaughter it for him that day, we force the butcher to slaughter it against his will. Even if the animal is a bull worth 1,000 dinars, and the buyer has a portion of it that is worth only 1 dinar, we force the butcher to slaughter the animal. Although the butcher will suffer a great loss if he cannot sell the rest of the meat, the buyer can compel him to slaughter the animal. The buyer has acquired the portion that he bought, and thus he can demand that the butcher slaughter the animal for him, so that he may eat his portion. Even though the buyer paid only for his portion and did not yet perform a kinyan, act of acquisition, the sages decreed that on these 4 occasions that is enough for him to acquire it. Therefore, i.e., since the buyer owns his portion, if it dies before being slaughtered and becomes a nevela, it dies for the buyer. That is, the buyer suffers the loss of his portion, and he cannot require the seller to give back his money. But on the other days of the year, it is not so. That is, if someone buys an animal or part of one on a day that is not one of the special 4 occasions, he cannot force the butcher to slaughter the animal for him. On most days of the year, when the standard law applies, a buyer does not acquire something merely by paying for it. He must also perform a kinyan. Since the buyer, in this case, did not perform a kinyan, he does not yet own any part of the animal, and has no right to force the buyer to slaughter it. Therefore, i.e., since the buyer does not own any part of the animal, if it dies before being slaughtered and becomes a nevela, it dies for the seller. That is, the seller suffers the loss, and he must refund the buyer's money.